संसद के दोनों सदनों में आर्थिक सर्वेक्षण पेश। मौजूदा वित्त वर्ष में विकास दर 6.75% रहने की उम्मीद। जीएसटी में प्रत्यक्ष करदाताओं की संख्या 50% बढ़ी। 2018-19 में विकास दर 7 से 7.5% रहने का अनुमान। राष्ट्रपति रामनाथ कोविंद के अभिभाषण से संसद के बजट सत्र की शुरुआत। संबोधन में देश की विकास दर को बताया प्रभावशाली। कहा पिछले 3.5 साल में महंगाई दर, चालू खाते का घाटा और राजकोषीय घाटा काबू में। प्रत्यक्ष विदेशी निवेश 36 अरब डॉलर से बढ़कर हुआ 60 अरब डॉलर। (2022) तक किसानों की आय दोगुना करने के लिए प्रतिबद्ध सरकार। राष्ट्रपति ने कहा देश में 275 मिलियन टन से ज्यादा खाद्यान्न और लगभग 300 मिलियन टन फल सब्जियों का हुआ रिकॉर्ड उत्पादन। लंबित 99 सिंचाई परियोजनाओं को पूरा करने पर जोर। राष्ट्रपति ने कहा 3 तलाक पर कानून बनने के बाद मुस्लिम महिलाओं को मिलेगा आत्मसम्मान। बेटियों के साथ भेदभाव खत्म करने के लिए बेटी बचाओ बेटी पढ़ाओ का 640 जिलों तक बढ़ाया दायरा। महिलाओं का वेतन के साथ मातृत्व अवकाश 12 की जगह 26 हफ्ते करने का प्रावधान। और संसद के बजट सत्र को सार्थक बनाने के लिए प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी की सभी दलों से सहयोग की अपील। कहा देश की आशा को पूरा करने वाला होगा बजट। तो लगातार चर्चा जारी है राष्ट्रपति के संबोधन भाषण पर, साथ ही साथ आर्थिक सर्वेक्षण जो आया है वो क्या इशारा कर रहा है, भविष्य की दिशा क्या होगी, सरकार के बजट के पिटारे में क्या कुछ होने वाला है। हमारे साथ कांग्रेस के प्रवक्ता मोहम्मद अली खान साहब भी इस वक्त जुड़ चुके हैं। आपका भी स्वागत है मोहम्मद साहब। मैं आगे बढ़ूं से पहले 2 और बातों की हम जो जिक्र कर रहे थे, एक तो फिजिकल डेफिसिट की बात हुई, उसके साथ साथ इस वक्त क्या स्थिति है। जिस तरीके से गौरव हमने देखा है कि चैलेंज रहा है सरकार के सामने, इस बार भी आर्थिक सर्वेक्षण में इसको लेकर कहीं चिंता भी नजर आ रही है। कंट्रोल करने की जो टूल और जो स्पेस था उसका सरकार ने बखूबी इस्तेमाल भी किया है। आगे क्या?
कि मुझे लगता है अब जो आने वाला जो ये एक आकलन ही है कि आने वाले जो बजट है उसमें थोड़ा सा फिस्कल इंडिपेंडेंस या आम जिसको कहते हैं हम कि आम को ट्विस्ट करने की थोड़ी सी जगह मिल जाएगी, क्योंकि आर्थिक सर्वेक्षण की भी प्रमुख बात में यह है कि इन्वेस्टमेंट के बिना ग्रोथ नहीं है। तो इन्वेस्टमेंट को बढ़ाने के लिए, प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट को बढ़ाने के लिए गवर्नमेंट अपनी स्पेंडिंग भी थोड़ी सी तेज करेगी और चुनावी साल में ज़्यादातर सरकारें स्पेंडिंग ज़्यादा रखती है और प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट को भी उससे बल मिलेगा। और जब वो होगा तो मुझे लगता है कि थोड़ा सा इसमें थोड़ा सा रिलैक्स मोड में रहेंगे, क्योंकि इतना ज़्यादा, क्योंकि मुझे लगता है कि ज़्यादा फिस्कल डेफिसिट के ऊपर केंद्रित करना भी भारत जैसे युवा देश के लिए ज़्यादा जरूरी नहीं है। हालांकि हो सकता है इससे रैंकिंग्स और रेटिंग्स बहुत इस पे आधारित रहती है, पर एम्प्लॉयमेंट और जो इन्वेस्टमेंट साइकिल है उसको रिवाइव करना मुझे लगता है बड़ी प्राथमिकता रहेगी रादर देन फिस्कल डिसिप्लिन। मैं ये नहीं कह रहा पूर्णतः अनडिसिप्लिन, पर थोड़ा सा इसमें आर्म्स को बड़ा चौड़ा करने का ढील देने की और ढील दी जाएगी, मुझे ढील दी जाएगी।
मोहम्मद अली खान साहब, आप अभी हमारे साथ जुड़े हैं, बीजेपी के हमारे साथ राजेंद्र अग्रवाल जी हैं। सबसे पहले तो जो इकोनॉमिक सर्वे है और राष्ट्रपति का भाषण, मैं आपका शुरुआती एक प्रतिक्रिया चाहूंगा। सरकार ने जो कहा या सरकार की ओर से जो बातें सामने कही गई हैं दिशा को लेकर और साथ ही साथ जो मंशा है उसको लेकर, क्या आपका कमेंट है?
देखिए, मंशा पे तो मैं सवाल नहीं उठाऊंगा, क्योंकि जो उन्होंने ये तथ्य आपके सामने रखे हैं और आज जो इन्होंने इकोनॉमिक सर्वे पेश किया है ये उस बात को दर्शाता है जो हम 3 साल से कह रहे हैं कि देश की आर्थिक स्थिति कमज़ोर होती जा रही है। मैं काफ़ी ज़हीन पैनलिस्ट्स की बात सुन रहा था, मैं काफ़ी देर से जुड़ा हुआ था, 15 मिनट से, और मेरी खुशनसीबी है कि मैंने उनके पॉइंट्स सुने। वो बिल्कुल सही कह रहे थे। 2 चीज़ें जिन पर आपको फोकस करना पड़ेगा, एक तो है आपको इनकम जनरेशन। प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट हो ही नहीं रहा है, इनके खुद के आंकड़े बताते हैं। जो आरबीआई का डेटा बड़े सच्चे तरीके से आरबीआई पिछले 1 साल से नौकरियों पे, जीडीपी पे, डिमोनेटाइजेशन पे, इन सब पे आंकड़े पेश करती जा रही पब्लिक डोमेन में बड़ी पारदर्शिता से। उन्हीं आंकड़ों को देखते हुए हम इस नतीजे पे पहुंचते हैं कि प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट, अभी अगर आपको मैं मिसाल दूं तो ऐसा हो गया जैसे हर 100 रुपए अगर सरकार लगाती है पब्लिक वर्क्स में, तो प्राइवेट सेक्टर अभी 10 रुपए लगा रहा है। ये बड़े लो लेवल्स ऑफ प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट हैं। आपको अगर प्रसंग देना चाहूँ मैं, तो मैं आपको बताऊंगा 2008-9 में जो पीक ईयर्स थे, उस दौरान हर 100 रुपए जो सरकार लगाती थी उस पर 50 से 60 रुपए प्राइवेट सेक्टर लगाता था। वो एक हेल्दी रेट ऑफ प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट था। इसे प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट रेशियो कहते हैं। देखिए, सरकार जो आपके लिए सुविधाएं प्रोवाइड करती है, चाहे वो हमारी ट्रेन सर्विसेज हो, सड़कें हो, कुछ भी हो, पोस्ट ऑफिस, पुलिस, फायरमैन, मगर वो प्रोवाइड करने के लिए उसके आमदनी के दो ही जरिए होते हैं। एक होता है टैक्सेशन और दूसरा होता है प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट। दुख की बात यह है, और मैं जो सर्वे पढ़ा है, देखिए गौर से पढ़ना पड़ेगा, इस पर थोड़ा वक्त लगाना पड़ेगा ऐसे, और आपके चैनल की मर्यादा है कि जो डिबेट होता है उसमें सब लोग पढ़ के ही आते हैं। तो मैं आपसे ये कहूँगा बस, जस्ट टू कंक्लूड माय ओपनिंग स्टेटमेंट, कि मुझे लगता है कि उन्होंने बातें तो सही कही हैं, मगर वो ही किया है जो हमेशा करते हैं, रोड मैप नहीं दिया है। रोड मैप मुझे नहीं दिख रहा है। ये एस्पिरेशनल स्टेटमेंट्स हैं, बड़े अच्छी मंशा दिखाती है सरकार की, मगर जब आपके पास 9 महीने रह गए मॉडल कोड ऑफ कंडक्ट लगने से पहले, तो आपको इससे ज़्यादा करना चाहिए था। मैं उम्मीद रखता हूँ आने वाले बजट में ये लोग कुछ करेंगे, खासतौर से कृषि और ग्रामीण क्षेत्रों में।
जी, लेकिन मोहम्मद जी, अगर हम देखें जो राष्ट्रपति के अभिभाषण में एक आंकलन भी किया गया है कि पिछले 4 साल में कितनी उपलब्धियां हैं, उन पर आपकी क्या टिप्पणी रहेगी? क्योंकि काफ़ी कुछ हुआ है, लेकिन ये भी संकेत दिया गया है कि रोज़गार के लिए कृषि क्षेत्र में काफ़ी बढ़त की गुंजाइश है, लेकिन जनधन योजना, मुद्रा योजना और बेटी बचाओ योजना, इससे काफ़ी फ़र्क भी पड़ा है।
अगर आप इन्हें सोशियो इकोनॉमिक स्कीम्स के नज़रिए से ज़्यादा देखेंगे बनिस्बत सिर्फ प्योर आर्थिक स्कीम्स के नज़रिए से, मैं आपसे ये कहूँगा, मेरी एक हिचकिचाहट है सरकार को लेके, वो ये है कि ये आर्थिक मुद्दों को प्राथमिकता नहीं देते। और आर्थिक मुद्दों को प्राथमिकता मिली थी आखिर में पिछले साल के, जब प्राइम मिनिस्टर की इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजरी काउंसिल बनी थी, जिसमें सुरजीत भल्ला और बाकी सब थे। और जनवरी में पहली बार 4 साल में हमारी सरकार ने ये माना, जब प्रधानमंत्री मोदी जी ने सबको बुलाया और कहा कि नौकरियां हमें प्रोड्यूस करनी है, हमारी इकोनॉमी में जॉबलेस ग्रोथ हो रही है, तो पहली बार भाजपा सरकार ने मांगा कि एक चुनौती है। आरबीआई ने पिछले साल रिपोर्ट पेश की थी कि 12 साल में सबसे कम नौकरियां जनरेट हो रही हैं, सरकारी नौकरियां कम होती जा रही हैं। ये एनेक्डोटल डेटा नहीं, ये आपको हार्ड डेटा बताता है। तो आज की तारीख पे आप इस बात को नज़रअंदाज नहीं कर सकते। अब देर आए चलिए दुरुस्त आए कहते हैं। जब भी मैं किसी भाजपा के जो आर्थिक प्रवक्ता होते हैं उनसे बात करता हूँ, वो कहते हैं हम लोग स्ट्रक्चरल रिफॉर्म्स में भरोसा रखते हैं। स्ट्रक्चरल रिफॉर्म्स बहुत अच्छी चीज़ है, मगर आप घर की बुनियाद बनाते बनाते ये भूल जाते हैं कि घर में लोग भी रह रहे हैं, उनकी आमदनी, उनका ख्याल भी रखना है आपको। मुझे लगता है उन सेक्टर्स में सरकार ने थोड़ी ताकीद की है, और सरकार को जो इकोनॉमिक नज़रिए से अगर इन्हें रिपोर्ट कार्ड दिया जाए तो मैं इन्हें 4 दूंगा 10 में से, और वो भी इसलिए क्योंकि इन्होंने जीएसटी का कुछ तो क्रियान्वयन कराया, हालांकि जल्दबाजी में किया।
खान साहब, इस वक्त हम अरविंद सुब्रमण्यम साहब प्रेस कॉन्फ्रेंस कर रहे हैं आर्थिक सर्वेक्षण के बाद। बहुत अहम होगा सुनना, शायद कुछ दिशा और कुछ नए संकेत भी मिले। आइए सीधे रुक करते हैं।
Dr. Arvind Subramanian ji. We also have CES team on the dais. My warm welcome to Principal Economic Advisor Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Senior Economic Advisor Dr. Archana Mathur, Senior Economic Advisor Dr. Arvind Sachdeva, Economic Advisor Mr. Arun Kumar, Economic Advisor Mr. Anthony Syriac, Economic Advisor Shri P.K. Abdul Karim. Friends, first the CA will make a detailed presentation, after which the floor is open for questions. Please follow the points of order as usual. A humble request, please keep your mobile phones on a switch off or silent mode. Over to the Chief Economic Advisor.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, and thanks to everyone for, first of all, thanks to Frank. Thanks to all of you for braving the traffic. Of course, it gives me great pleasure in showing off this year's economic survey for 2017-18. Okay. So something like this, as you know, cannot be done by any one individual or a group of individuals. And I'm presenting this on behalf of a number of people. And I'd like to acknowledge some of them. My apologies, I'm going to miss some. In fact, if you look at the acknowledgements page or pages in the survey, it's really quite long, and I'm sure it should have been longer, so apologies. First of all, I'd like to thank the staff of the Economic Division, my colleagues who are sitting here, my officers of Team CEA, as we call it. I would also like to thank very much, the physical act of actually producing it. It takes a lot of effort. I would like to thank the coordinating unit, its head, and especially Aftab and Ashwini for really having seen through the process very carefully. Lots of people who are not here have also contributed. Don't want to name all of them, but including some people in the US who came to contribute for this, to work for this. I'd like to thank them as well. I'd like to thank my colleagues who work with me, in the Ministry of Finance, especially the two that I work closest with, Dr. Hasmukh Adhya and Mr. Subhash Garg. I mean, one couldn't ask for better colleagues like that in the ministry to work with. Of course, I would love to thank my boss, the Honorable Finance Minister, without whom, of course, none of this could happen. His support, his guidance, the cover that he provides have just been amazing in making all these 4 surveys that we've done possible. So a very special thanks to him. Last but not least this year, I want to extend a special, very, very special thanks to a group of people who kind of don't get enough, I think, credit for the work that we do. In the last survey and in this survey, we've spoken a lot about how we use big data. And I'm going to show you this year as well. We've used a lot of big data to come up with new facts and evidence. But we can work with big data only if we get big data. And we get big data, or we've got big data, thanks to numerous colleagues in government, the deputy secretaries, the undersecretaries, the joint secretaries, the directors, in their own quiet ways, they've been helping us enormously. And I'd like to thank 2 people in particular who are here. I want them to stand up, both for themselves, but also for who they represent. Mr. Nilendu Mishra and Mr. Prakash Kumar, please stand up. I'd like to thank, it's people like this who, with their generous time, support, and guidance, who make some of the work possible here. In fact, but for Mr. Kumar and his colleagues in GSTN, a lot of the work which I'm going to show you would not have been possible. Of course, the cover is pink. We just wanted to make sure that we too, in our own small way, contribute to expressing our support to the movement in favor of women and women's empowerment. In fact, there's a whole chapter in the survey on gender. So with that, let me quickly get to the economic survey itself. This year we have 2 volumes. We've gone back to the tradition. Last year we did it over 2 cycles. I think it confused a lot of people, and therefore we've gone back to 2 volumes. Volume 2 is, of course, the review of what happened over the last year, and in Volume 1 we build way of proceeding. I need to judge whether all of you are alert and awake. I don't want to bore you too much. So the presentation, it's in 5 parts: achievements, the analytical review, in particular, understanding the temporary decoupling of the Indian economy. That naturally leads to the outlook for 2017-18, the rest of the year, and the next year, and the policy agenda. If I have time, I want to highlight some of the exciting new research that we've done that's presented in Volume 1. And I want to conclude with some big and big thoughts, maybe big and hopeless thoughts, but big thoughts nevertheless. Okay, what are the major achievements this year? I think that I would single out 2 or 3 very prominent ones. the launch of the transformational GST at the stroke of the midnight hour on July 1st. I think what is really important to take away also is the fact, as the finance minister said the other day or yesterday, that not only was it launched, and for something of such scale, complexity and scope, there were bound to be teething challenges. And I think it's fair to say that one of the remarkable things was, the mid-course, the corrective, expeditious actions that were taken, which have led to a kind of stabilization of the GST. Second, I think that, as you all know, from the very first survey onwards, we have spoken about the twin balance sheet challenge, over-indebted firms or undercapitalized banks, which had kind of held back growth for a long time. We call that the twin balance sheet challenge. I think this year, a series of really very important steps have been taken. The resolution that's underway under the IBC and the NCLT process. And of course, very recently, the capitalizations, actually the details were announced. I think we think of the twin balance sheet challenge as having 4 R's, recognition, resolution, recapitalization, and reforms. And I think we're now really well ahead on almost all of them. I'll talk about reforms in a couple of seconds, but I think these were very, very important. The binding constraint festering was the twin balance sheet challenge, and I think there's some decisive tackling of that's taken place. So, as validation of these achievements and recognizing India's medium-term prospects, I think for the first time in 14 years, India got the sovereign ratings upgrade. And of course, we jumped many ranks in the ease of doing business. So these were, I think, quite very important, even transformational achievements this year. As I said, in order to understand what is happening or what's going to happen in the rest of the year and the next year, we really need to understand what happened in the last, 4 to 6 quarters. And I think one way to think about this is to see why the Indian economy decoupled from the rest of the economy for about 4 to 6 quarters. As you can see that, for a period, India was accelerating while the world was decelerating. And then from the middle of 2016, kind of the reverse process happened. And that is a bit of a puzzle. And we need to understand why that happened to see what's going to happen going forward. I think this temporary decoupling happened. We explained that in the overview chapter for 4 reasons. First, I think there was this competitiveness impact from the 2 major policy actions, demonetization and GST. And you can see that, this is not proof, but it's all suggestive evidence that for about 1 to 2 quarters, you can see highlighted in white how exports decelerated very sharply and imports accelerated very sharply. So that was kind of some evidence that there was an impact from the 2 policy actions. Then, of course, beginning in the early to middle of 2016, our interest rates went up very sharply. See how we decoupled from the rest of the world. So interest rates affected demand. In turn, capital came in, strengthened the exchange rate, as you can see on the right-hand side. That also affected our competitiveness. If you look at the trade balance and the services balance, they were affected by that, and that also had a dampening effect on real activity. And this was, again, different from the rest of the world. That's why we kind of decoupled from the rest of the world to some extent. The 4th factor, which I'll talk about later, is, of course, oil prices. Also, oil prices went up. That affected consumption and the government finances, and that also held back real economic activity. So these kind of 4 factors contributed to the decoupling. And immediately you can see, therefore, what happens going forward. We see now that there is a robust and broad-based revival. Several indicators of activity. We've shown manufacturing growth, GVA growth, even investment, exports, net private transfers, credit, they've all started to pick up. The direction is very good. The level is still below potential, should keep that in mind. But in terms of directionally, the economy seems to be picking up quite nicely, quite robustly, and that's what's happening now. So in terms of the short-term outlook,
injecting a fair amount of demand into the economy. And above all, I think that exports have picked up quite briskly in the last 3 quarters, apart from that dip that I showed you. If you look at that same export chart and look at the last 4 quarters, you will see that Indian growth is about manufacturing export growth is about 11.3%, which is very healthy and kind of broadly in line with the way the world economy is going. So exports are driving growth. The temporary factors are receding. Private investment going forward will depend a lot upon capacity utilization and the progress under the IBC. Consumption, I'm going to come back, is going to be a little bit challenged because of oil prices going forward. So the growth projection, which all of you have already seen, for 17-18, it's 6.75%. It's higher than the CSO's estimate, in large part because the CSO has itself acknowledged that they weren't able to fully take account of recent developments. So I don't think they would be at all, they would contest this projection in any way. 6.75 on the real, and also inflation is higher in the second half than the first half, which they weren't fully able to incorporate. We project nominal GDP growth this year for about 10.5%. And going forward next year, because of all these factors, we think that growth will rise to between 7 and 7.5. You've, of course, seen the IMF and World Bank projections, so this is in the ballpark. Now, all projections, these are projections. They have a lot of error bands around them. Nobody is perfect. I think there's both upside potential, but there's also, challenges and risks that have to be factored in when thinking about this baseline forecast. Export growth could be greater. We find, for example, that exports are growing in line with world growth. There's a kind of a standard elasticity, but that is still lower than what this response of exports was in the previous period. So if export responsiveness picks up, export growth could be higher.
The previous period. So if export responsiveness picks up, export growth could be higher and overall GDP growth could be higher. And also, I think if the IBC process progresses well, expeditiously, if actions happen on time, if they're accepted without any glitches, then I think there is a chance that private investment, after so many years of languishing, could also pick up as well. But in terms of the downside risks, I think that we should all be aware of that. There are factors that we should be very, very watchful about. If oil prices remain at current levels, I think there will be challenges. We know a rule of thumb: every $10 increase in the price of oil, GDP growth comes down by about 0.2 to 0.3%. The current account deficit will deteriorate by about, again, 0.4 percentage points of GDP, $10 billion. Inflation will be higher also by about 0.2, 0.3%. So I think we need to watch oil prices very carefully. That's a risk. Also, sharp corrections to elevated stock prices. Stock prices are elevated. I'll come back to that in a second. If something sharp happens, I think that's another risk we should. And, having seen emerging market experiences around the world for the last 20, 25 years, I think we should always be watchful when, the macro risks mount, when asset prices are high, that you get this emerging market sudden stall. There's a famous phrase, sudden stop of capital flows. But in India, I think we should worry not about anything serious, but sudden stalls in capital flows, because then macro policies will then have to be tighter. Then you get the classic dilemma between stability and growth, and then has all these consequences. So in a sense, and you can see oil prices 17-18 this year about 16% higher than last year, which have held back consumption, and the IMF forecast is for another 12% higher growth next year compared to this year. So that's going to be a risk that we have to contend with. So in a sense, if you wanted to, in a nutshell, capture the current macroeconomic conjuncture, it's about both the story of revival and the story of risk. And markets are reflecting that actually beautifully. Stock prices are at record levels. which means that there's expectations of, dynamism going forward, GDP, profit earnings, but interest rates have risen very sharply as well, reflecting concerns about the deficit, oil, slightly higher inflation. So this duality of revival and risk is in some ways the current saga of macroeconomic policy today, which I think we should, take account of very carefully. And of course, there is the story about the elevated stock prices, which also we should factor into account. So in some ways, when people say, what is the policy agenda? And we know that this is a very special year ahead for obvious reasons, which I don't have to go into. So I think that in some ways, my own view is that the government doesn't have to do anything new and radical, etc. Just, finishing what it has started already would be, I think, a very ambitious and a very fantastic agenda to complete. Supporting agriculture, because we know there are stresses in the agricultural sector, which are described in the economic survey. Stabilize the GST. I think that we need to stabilize GST because export refunds, compliance, revenue will still have to be achieve an equilibrium. I think we need to complete the twin balance sheet actions. I think that resolution and recapitalization must be accompanied by reforms to kind of shrink the unviable ones and to signal greater private sector participation in the better ones. Finish privatizing Air India, and no small, no mean task to head off any macroeconomic pressures and the possibility of a sudden stall from rising oil prices and possible. This is not a high probability scenario, but as they say, only the paranoid survive, and so eternal vigilance is the price of macroeconomic stability, which I think we need to have going forward. Now, so if I were you and if I wanted you to, kind of cover a few things tomorrow morning's newspapers, apart from what you may already be intending to do, I think there are 4 or 5 in Chapter 1 very important pieces of new evidence which speak to some of the current macroeconomic policy issues. For example, we find that since November 2016, there's been a big increase in individual income tax filers of about 1.8 million new and additional over and above trend growth. The number of GST taxpayers has increased by about 50%, and there's also been some nice boost to individual income tax collections, which are described in box 2. Second very important thing about understanding GST revenues, when the GST numbers for January came out, 2 newspapers had exactly the opposite interpretations of the data, and I want to give you the definitive interpretation of the data that you must go away with. You may ignore me if you want, but you must go away with this, which is the following. Interpreting GST revenues has been really confused, complicated, 11 months, 12 months, IGST, CGST, etc., etc. Forget all of that. If you want to see how the GST is doing, look at what were the pre-GST revenues, which was something like, I think the number is 9.6 million in 2016-17, and what is the total sum of GST revenues this year, and then you have to make some adjustments for one-off factors. If you do that, we find that GST revenues are growing at about 12%, and the buoyancy is well above historical. So for such the early experience of such a transformative change is already providing fairly buoyant revenues. So I think the promise going forward is very good. Similarly, I think we showed that the textile package had some important effects on one particular sector, ready-made garments, not all, which you should look at. One point I want to emphasize to all those market watchers here is that our view is that markets are misinterpreting the borrowing by central and state governments. Markets kind of correlate in a one-to-one fashion market borrowings with the underlying fiscal deficit. In India, that's not quite right. In fact, it's wrong. You should read box 8. And our estimate is that about 40,000 crores of extra borrowing by the center and the states does not reflect the underlying deficit. by either of these. So I think that's an important message. It's also, for me, it's a valuable learning experience to understand how to think about borrowing, the deficit, and other aspects of our fiscal arrangements. Last, important, there's a whole 3.5-page box on how to think about the Indian stock market boom. It is different from what's going on around the world, but for very different reasons. And you should read up that. But I think that what the takeaway from that is that there is no room for complacency on this level of asset prices. We need heightened vigilance. Boredom level on a scale of 0 to 10 is 0 or 10? Stamina for 10 minutes, 15 minutes? Yeah? I take it yes? Yes? Yes, yes. Not from this side, that side. Okay. So I want to highlight some new analysis and research that we've done. Not everything, but a few highlights. I think that, if you read chapter 2 on the GST, again, thanks to the cooperation we got, I learned 8 things about the Indian economy that I did not know. I mean, it's just amazing how much the GST is going to, forget about taxes, revenues, buoyancies, etc. Our understanding of the Indian economy is going to increase by an order of magnitude, and we have some early samplers from that. For example, I told you about the increase in indirect taxpayers. Also, how many, taxpayers filed under the GST who did not have to file, who did not have to be part of the composition scheme. Huge numbers. For the first time, I think we have estimates of the size of the formal sector in India. Formal sector employment, formal sector economic activity. And I think I was blown away. So, for example, if you take the stock of formal employment in the non-agricultural sector, our estimate is that between 30 and 50% of this workforce is employed in the formal sector. It's a stock estimate, not a flow estimate. Similarly, if you look at the structure of exports in India, very unusual, very different from other countries. For the first time ever in the history of Indian economics, we have estimates of which states export how much internationally. It's amazing. And if you look at that and analyze that, you find that states that export more are also internationally are also the states that are more prosperous in terms of having a higher per capita GST. So this is just, I mean, the kind of wow, the epiphanic understanding that we got from the Indian economy is possible, and the GST is going to provide more and more such insights going forward. We have a chapter on investment savings slowdown. In general, what are the lessons for India? You find that the Indian investment savings slowdown is unusual, never happened before like this. It's been long. Investment went up 9 percentage points in 4 years. It's come down by about 6 percentage points over 8 years, and that's still continuing. And I think this has implications for how quickly investment will turn around. One very important thing is that, people, if you think about India, and in fact all over the world, people think investment and savings are the same, I mean, routinely people will say, we must raise investment, we must raise savings. But actually there's a big difference. It's actually very much more important or urgent to reignite investment than it is to raise savings, for example. We have a chapter saying, can India continue its dynamism going forward compared to other countries, from a kind of development perspective, looking at other countries as well. And, there's a lot of talk about the middle income trap. The middle income trap turned out to be not true, but something similar could potentially happen to a low middle income country like India. It's not inevitable, but, there are these headwinds coming against countries like India, the globalization backlash, which means our exports will be affected. Can we move from low productivity sectors to higher productivity dynamic sectors? I think you see the evidence in India is still not compelling and powerful. Human capital, how are we doing? There's a box we do based on USSR data on how far we are truly away from the global human capital frontier, and it should give us pause for thought, which is reflection, because we're still very far away from that. And of course, the climate change, we have a chapter on that, which I'll talk about in a second, which also. So these are all headwinds that are going to challenge India going forward in other countries, and we talk about how we should meet them. Climate change, we have a whole chapter which uses detailed data, and really want to thank Dr. Rajivan and the Department of Biosciences giving us such detailed data which we were able to analyze. And we have some really, really interesting findings, how India is becoming hotter, drier, more extreme, and we calculate that agricultural incomes in the medium term could decline by about 25%, especially there's a big divide between irrigated India and unirrigated India, between rain-fed crops and irrigated crops. So really fascinating findings on that. We have a whole chapter on gender, and I think inconsistent with that, and lots of things to say about gender, and I'm not going to go into that. But one of the new things we say in this, which I don't think has been pointed out enough, is that we know that the sex ratio in India is highly skewed. If you go to Punjab, Haryana, you'll see it. But there is a different and maybe deeper phenomenon of son preference, which we call son meta preference. You can get at that not by looking at the sex ratio at birth, but by looking at the sex ratio of the last child. Is the last child more male than female? And what you find is that in India, it's very striking. You look at the difference between the top two charts. That's the sex ratio. If it's the last child, skewed towards males. If it's not the last child, more females. So it's really quite striking, and that's not true of a country like Indonesia and many, many other countries. So we use this to come up with a cute new it's kind of a new notional category of unwanted girls, and we estimate there are about 21 million unwanted girls in India. This is kind of parallels. Amartya Sen had this famous calculation about missing women. I think there's a kind of a deeper counterpart to that. But then on gender, there's a reason for optimism. I think we've improved on a lot of indicators, but on some indicators we haven't improved. And this deeper societal son preference is partly one of them. For the first time, we have a chapter on science and technology. I think that we are saying that science and technology needs a big push. We need to increase the R&D, and perhaps we need to do this much more in mission mode. I mean, I think very, very important, the scientific temper of debate, openness, inquiry, lack of dogma, lack of religious obscurantism. All of this, I think, is very important. I think if we are to become a major producer of knowledge, I think this requires a big push. And then we have a whole chapter on the dependency and the delays in the judicial and appellate process. I would urge you to read that. If you look at the High Court, the Supreme Court, Tax Department, appellate tribunals, I mean, the stock of pendencies is high and rising, and we think the next frontier in terms of improving the ease of doing business, where we've done very well so far, is in fact to get more timely, less delayed justice. And I think this is a chart which shows how the pendencies are rising in the tribunals and the tax department. And one of the terms that we used in an early survey was cooperative and competitive federalism, how the center and the states should interact. And here we have this slightly provocative idea of maybe should we have something like a cooperative separation of powers between government and judiciary, with a view to actually expediting, the process of delay insofar as it affects economic activity, and that's something that we discuss in a chapter as well. So the chapters on science and technology and pendency in the judicial process are actually new and probably have not received as much focus in past surveys. We wanted to emphasize that. Now, this is my last slide. I'll stop. So coming back to the current conjuncture, a lot of achievements, revival in activity, but also, need to keep in mind as the overall framework.
Last year we highlighted some, but I think education, employment and agriculture will continue to be key challenges. We discussed some or all of them in greater detail. I think that's well known. But I want to kind of end with two more kind of positive or hopeful lessons of the last year going forward. This is a phrase that I'm hereby taking a patent on this phrase. Anyone who uses it tomorrow.
This is a phrase that I'm hereby taking a patent on this phrase. Anyone who uses it tomorrow will have to pay me a small royalty. And this, if you look over the last 50, 60 years in India, and I'm generalizing and being very glib, I think we've moved in terms of our attitude towards the private sector and the role of the private sector from crony socialism to stigmatized capitalism. I think that's where I think we've been for many years. Stigmatized capitalism, that's why we're very ambivalent about the private sector. I think that that is what made reforms in terms of the twin balance sheet challenge so difficult. The fear that you could end up favoring, the private sector, especially those who did these bad things or imprudent things during the infrastructure boom. I think that if we can address this twin balance sheet challenge with the measures that we're taking, it would actually go a long way. First, towards cracking the problem of exit that's been a problem in India, but also it's a very, very noteworthy response in this, what I call mahal of stigmatized capitalism. That's kind of, and that's something that augurs well for the future going forward. The last, and I think maybe the most hopeful thing that I take away from this last year is that all of us know about the GST and how good it's been. And also its teething challenges and how the government is trying to overcome them. And I've now spoken about what an amazing repository of information and data GST is going to be. But I want to end by saying that, the GST Council, the working of the GST Council has shown that cooperative federalism can really work. I mean, if you look at the quality of discussions, the tenor of discussions, and I am firmly of the view that let me step back. When people say, what does India need to do by way of policy reform? I can name 20 and you can probably name 40 even better than my 20. But always the question is, how do you get this thing done? Especially in areas where states are involved. I think that's the question that we really have to grapple with. And my own view is that GST Council, cooperative federalism are almost like a technology or how-to of reform going forward, and that needs to be applied in many, many other areas. One marketed power, agriculture, DBT, portability of benefits, health, education, you name it, any area where the centers providing money, the states are involved. I think we need to use the cooperative federalism technology that the GST Council has shown can be made to work in India. Thank you very much for your time, and let's have questions now.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Arvind Subramanian ji, for your excellent and insightful.
तो चीफ इकोनॉमिक एडवाइजर डॉक्टर अरविंद सुब्रमण्यम जो कि बता रहे थे इकोनॉमिक सर्वे को लेकर और चैलेंजेस किस तरीके से उन्होंने पहले जो शुरुआत की थी और आज तक जो हुआ है, ट्विन बैलेंस शीट की बात की, 4R का जिक्र किया और बढ़ते क्रूड ऑयल प्राइसेस को लेकर उन्होंने चिंता भी जाहिर की। और मेरे साथ मेरी सहयोगी ट्रेसी हैं और लगातार दोनों खास मेहमान बने हुए हैं। गौरव, अगर मैं थोड़ा सा और जो हम चर्चा कर रहे थे उसमें एक अहम बात निकल रही थी डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट को लेकर, और जो सरकार ने लक्ष्य तय किए थे उसको मीट आउट भी किया है सरकार ने। एयर इंडिया का जिक्र ज़रूर किया सुब्रमण्यम साहब ने, जो ट्वीट भी किए हैं और सोशल मीडिया पे जो उनकी बातें आई हैं, उस दिशा में कितना कुछ स्कोप दिख रहा है और वो कितना फर्टाइल लैंड दिखता है फिलहाल निवेश के लिहाज से, या फिर जो हम बात करते हैं पुशअप करने के लिए, इन्वेस्टमेंट को आगे बढ़ाने के लिए?
देखिए, जो इकोनॉमिक सर्वे में भी बात कही कि फिनिश द अनफिनिश्ड रेजोल्यूशंस, अदरवाइज दे विल नेवर बी गोइंग टू बी फिनिश्ड। तो आपने जो रिजॉल्व किया है डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट को, मैं दो परिप्रेक्ष्य से देखता हूँ। एक तो ये एक आर्म है गवर्नमेंट को अतिरिक्त पैसा जुटाने का, और दूसरा वो ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस है उनको रिवाइव करने का, जो कि सरकारी तंत्र में ऐसी फंस गई है कि उसको नया पैसा, नई सोच और नए विज़न की ज़रूरत है। तो ये दोनों परिप्रेक्ष्य, और तीसरा अगर हम इसको चाणक्य के अर्थशास्त्र से जोड़ें तो उसमें हमेशा एक सूक्ति थी कि राजा को कभी भी बिजनेस में नहीं आना चाहिए। तो ये तीनों पर्सपेक्टिव से डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट एक बहुत ही लाभदायक प्रक्रिया है, और निश्चित रूप से बड़े डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट करने का विरोध भी होता है, क्योंकि उसमें कई लोगों के इंटरेस्ट होते हैं, कई एम्प्लॉयज़ होते हैं, उनके इंटरेस्ट की हितों की रक्षा करनी जरूरी होती है। तो एक समग्र प्रक्रिया के रूप में डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट को आगे लिया जाए और इसको कंप्लीट किया जाए। अनफिनिश छोड़ दिया तो ये वापस, क्योंकि पिछले 15 साल से एयर इंडिया के डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट की बात हो रही, तो कभी भी इस अनफिनिश्ड एजेंडा को छोड़ दिया यहाँ तो वापस मान लो जो भी सरकारें आई तो वो वापस पॉइंट जीरो से चालू होगा। तो ये एक बड़ी बात है। तीनों पर्सपेक्टिव से डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट इज ए वेलकम मूव बाय द गवर्नमेंट, और इसके कई सकारात्मक नतीजे भी हैं डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट में। मैं आपको बताऊं कि कई ऐसी कंपनियां जिसमें सरकार का मार्केट कैप डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट के बाद जो पहले 100% उसके पास शेयर था उससे ज्यादा हो गया। मींस आज मेरे पास 35% है, पहले 100% मेरी कंपनी थी, अब मैंने डिसइन्वेस्ट करके मेरे पास 30% रह गया, पर 30% का मार्केट कैप पहले 100% से 5 गुना ज्यादा हुआ है, क्योंकि नई सोच, नया ऊर्जा, नया तंत्र और नए मार्केट्स। नहीं तो आप एक ही तरीके से एक ही गलती रिपीट, और जिसको हम इकोनॉमिक्स की भाषा में कहते हैं एवरग्रीनिंग प्रॉब्लम, मींस उस लॉस को हटाने के लिए बड़ा, उस लॉस को हटाने के लिए उससे बड़ा। तो इस प्रक्रिया को खत्म करने की सख्त जरूरत है
जी। और शुभ में डिसइन्वेस्टमेंट के साथ साथ जब सरकार के एजेंडे को देखें और जो मूल मंत्र है हर शख्स की इनकम को बढ़ाने की बात हो रही है, उसके लाइवलीहुड को बढ़ाने की बात हो रही है, उनके इनकम्स, उनके अर्निंग, उनके सोशल स्ट्रक्चर के लिहाज से उनको बढ़ाने की बात है। पर कैपिटा इनकम के जो आंकड़े हमारे सामने हैं इस बार, सोशल सेक्टर्स को अगर उसे जोड़ते हैं, ये इशारा क्या है? और जो सरकार की सोशल सेक्टर्स की स्कीम्स रही हैं, जो अब बड़े अनाउंसमेंट रहे हैं मोदी सरकार के, उसका रिजल्ट अगर हम इसके तौर पर देखें तो क्या कुछ समझते हैं?
राइट। और एक बारी फिर से मैं वो पुराना इकोनॉमिक सर्वे को मैं देख रहा था। इनफैक्ट क्योंकि जब एक सरकार का टर्म ख़त्म होने वाला होता है तो उनके जो स्टार्टिंग के पॉइंट से जो शुरू किए थे, उनके क्या क्या एस्पिरेशन थे, क्या आइडियाज़ थे, और उसमें मैं देख रहा था कि उसमें ये आंका गया था। इनफैक्ट अरविंद सुब्रमण्यम का वो पहला सर्वे था 2014-15 के, इसके पहले मैं 13-14 का भी जिक्र कर रहा था, और उसमें उन्होंने कहा था कि हमारा जो ट्रैजेक्टरी वुड अलाउ द कंट्री टू अटेन द फंडामेंटल ऑब्जेक्टिव ऑफ वाइपिंग एवरी टीयर फ्रॉम एवरी आई while affording the opportunities for increasingly young, middle class and aspirational India to realize its limitless potential. And what it basically says is that the economy had been rendered more stable, the reforms have been launched, and the India is in a sweet spot. So given that condition, हम लोग वहाँ से कितना इस 5 साल में कितना रास्ता उसका तय किए हैं। पर कैपिटा इनकम का आपने जिक्र किया, विच इज़ अ वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट मेजर करने के लिए कि कहाँ तक इंडिविजुअल एक आदमी के लिए कितना कितना फ़ायदा हुआ है। तो अगर उसी सर्वे के हिसाब से अगर हम देखें जो चीज़ें शुरुआत के जो प्लान्स किए गए थे, जैसे एलपीजी गैस कनेक्शन जी, जनधन का हमने पहले ही जिक्र किया, साथ में इन सारी चीज़ें जिसे मुद्रा स्कीम, जिसके बारे में पहले भी गौरव वल्लभ जी डिस्कस कर रहे थे, इन सारे स्कीम्स डेफिनेटली कुछ हद तक कारगर सिद्ध हुए हैं, कुछ काफ़ी अच्छी तरह से काफ़ी अच्छे कारगर सिद्ध हुए हैं। लेकिन अभी भी जो जिसे कहते हैं द ग्रोथ के जो स्वीट स्पॉट थे, इम्पॉर्टेंट पॉइंट ये है इस इकोनॉमिक सर्वे का, मैं उसमें फिर से आ रहा हूँ कि वो जो एक अपॉर्चुनिटी था इंडिया का, वो 5 साल के अंदर वो अपॉर्चुनिटी जो इंटरनेशनल एनवायरनमेंट के बहुत सारी चीज़ों की वजह से जो तैयार हुआ था, वो अपॉर्चुनिटी कुछ हद तक कम होता दिखाई दे रहा है। और अभी इकोनॉमिक सर्वे यही बताता है कि अभी भारत को आगे का रास्ता जो चलना है, जो तय करना है, वो अपने आप के इंटरनल स्ट्रेंथ से ही चलना पड़ेगा। एक्सपोर्ट्स शायद बेनिफिट्स मिलेंगे, लेकिन उसकी जिसे कहते हैं छवि बाहर की दुनिया का, जिसका आप प्रोटेक्शनिज्म की बात कर रहे थे, उसको देखते हुए बहुत ज़्यादा अनुकूल नहीं दिखता है।
इसको बहुत ज़्यादा नहीं है, पोटेंशियल वहाँ पर चैलेंजेस ज़्यादा हैं।
यानी कि इकोनॉमिक सर्वे इस वक्त बता रहे हैं कि 5 साल पहले हम लोग तो द गवर्नमेंट टुक सम चैलेंजेस, टुक सम रिस्क्स, एंड कुछ हद तक कुछ चीज़ों में डेफिनेटली सक्सेसफुल हुए हैं। स्ट्रक्चरल रिफॉर्म्स की जो बात कर रहे थे, बहुत सारी चीज़ें, मूलभूत टैक्स रिफॉर्म्स की जो बात हुई थी इन टर्म्स ऑफ जीएसटी, और इस बारी शायद बात हो रही है कि डायरेक्ट टैक्स में भी कुछ उस तरह के, उस स्केल में नहीं, बट कुछ हद तक जो अरविंद मोदी कमेटी सेटअप किए गए हैं उसके रिपोर्ट आना बाकी है। लेकिन उसके बहुत सारे, आई अंडरस्टैंड, बहुत सारी चीज़ें उनके अमल किए जाएंगे बजट में, तो उन सारी चीज़ों के चेंजेस आएंगे। लेकिन साथ में सोशल सेक्टर में उस वक्त भी कहा गया था कि एम्प्लॉयमेंट हमारे के लिए सबसे बड़ा चैलेंज है। तो एम्प्लॉयमेंट इसी सरकार के, ये मानना जरूर पड़ेगा कि एम्प्लॉयमेंट सिर्फ इसी सरकार के टाइम में एम्प्लॉयमेंट चैलेंज नहीं बना,
एक बड़ी समस्या है,
एक बहुत बड़ी लंबा चैलेंज है, और वो भी उस वक्त भी था और वो अभी भी है। और चूंकि बहुत सारी चीज़ें सिद्ध हुए हैं, इसलिए लोगों का अपेक्षा बढ़ गया है कि हमें मिलना चाहिए वो चांसेस जो हम, जिसके लिए हम तैयार हो रहे हैं, जिसके लिए हमारी राइट है मिलने का। और किसी भी सरकार के लिए, गोइंग आउट सरकार के लिए, ये एक बहुत बड़ा चुनौती है देखना कि हम उस चीज़ पे, उस एक बहुत बड़ा मानदंड है कि लिविंग स्टैंडर्ड को उसमें उठा पाए हैं। तो मेरा मानना यह है कि इकोनॉमिक सर्वे ये दिखाता है कि हमने एसेट क्रिएशन बहुत सारी जगह पे हुए हैं, इनकम क्रिएशन में अभी भी बहुत सारे जगहों पे वीकनेसेस रह गए हैं।
All right, I would like to in fact take away the focus a bit from the internal factors and talk a bit about the external factors, because we're running short of time. We've got to wind this up. But you know, talking about the external factors, the mention of course was there by even Mr. Subramanian about the oil prices and how that is also going to factor upon how GDP is going to eventually be rated, and inflation also to a certain extent. Give us an idea of how external factors will also determine how the coming up fiscal year is going to be affected.
So among the external factors, the biggest weakness that India has is while India has built up oil security in terms of strategic oil reserves, we have built up a security. So there's no risk on that score. It's also a fact, as Kavin was pointing out, the foreign exchange is now very strong, $414 billion and are going up, and the Indian rupee is strong. So India definitely is in a better position to be able to counter the impact of an oil shock. There's no doubt about it. But the point is that the oil risk is a major risk for the economy, because it's not just oil. The point is an economy runs, and this is where I'm taking away words from Gaulav's mouth, but the oil is essentially the plumbing line. Oil, coal, energy commodities determine how fast an economy can run. And unfortunately, most of it has to be imported. Our solar things we have done remarkably well. Last year, there's been a 10 gigawatt rise in solar power that's been installed, but it's still, we are dependent. And that is going to be a very major headwind for India to handle in the next 2 years at least, given the current situation in the oil market, what IEA or the other international projections are looking at.
Gaurav, your take?
See, I consider with oil there are various other commodities also. There is a pressure on those commodities also, like pressure on what we are importing from the other countries, and pressure on how much we can export. We had seen that our soft spots in the export is textile, leather. Leather had lost its shine in the past. So how to go back to that level? And then naturally current account deficits are going to impact the ultimate philosophy of the budget making or ultimate philosophy of social sector spending of the country. So I think that global arena is more uncertain in the next few years in comparison to the past 3-4 years. And from the global perspective, situations are well under control in the past, and we had seen that oil prices were almost half of the average oil prices in the past, or more, less than half. And now they had started going up. So I think a more cautious approach, and what Subramanian was saying, that we are more a demographic dividend blessed country, so we are having our own internal consumption which may keep reviving the economy. But mind it, that demographic dividend also comes with a challenge that 65% of people are under 35, so we have to get the employment for them, and that's a major thing. So I think in the next 1 or 2 years, the major focus, I'm again and again saying, should be on the private investment cycle, which was highlighted in economic survey also. And a very interesting finding that consumption is not something which we should target. It's investment which revives the economic growth with exports.
Then which sectors do you believe कि जहाँ पर हमें फोकस करना होगा इन्वेस्टमेंट के लिहाज से, खासतौर पर प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट लिहाज से, और जब दुनिया की डेवलपिंग जो इकोनॉमी है वहाँ से अगर हम कंपेयर करें और कंपटीशन क्योंकि वहाँ से ज़रूर होगा, तो फिर हमें क्या और सुविधा या क्या कुछ और नए नियम लचीले रूप के साथ हमें आगे आना होगा?
जब तक कोर सेक्टर में मैन्युफैक्चरिंग नहीं बढ़ेगी, तब तक आपका प्राइवेट इन्वेस्टमेंट साइकिल नहीं बढ़ सकता। कोर सेक्टर में सीमेंट, कंक्रीट, सरिये, ये सारे सेक्टर्स और ये सेक्टर्स इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर को डायरेक्टली इम्पैक्ट करते हैं। तो जब तक कोर सेक्टर में इन्वेस्टमेंट नहीं बढ़ेगा, भले वो स्टील हो, कोल हो, आज हमारी स्टील कंपनियां जो बाहर के देशों से जो इंपोर्टेड स्टील है उसकी जो यहाँ पे लैंडेड प्राइस है, हमारी कॉस्ट उससे ज़्यादा है, तो वहाँ पे टेक्नोलॉजिकल इंटरवेंशन करना पड़ेगा और कोर सेक्टर पे फोकस, क्योंकि वही वो सेक्टर है जहाँ से एम्प्लॉयमेंट मिल सकता है अर्बन इंडिया को। और शुरुआत में जो हमने बात कही थी कि एग्रीकल्चर को और रूरल इकोनॉमी के लिए अलग अलग नीतियां बनाई जाए, एग्रीकल्चर और रूरल इकोनॉमी को मर्ज ना किया जाए, क्योंकि एग्रीकल्चर हमारे देश में आज भी 5 महीने का काम है। 7 महीने रूरल इकोनॉमी को जब तक रिवाइव नहीं किया तब तक आपकी डबलिंग द इनकम, पर कैपिटा इनकम, क्योंकि पर कैपिटा इनकम 60% जनसंख्या तो वहां बैठी है, जब तक उनकी पर कैपिटा नहीं बढ़ी तो आप 40% से कितनी बढ़ा लोगे, और बढ़ भी गई मान लो तो भी वो अनइवन ग्रोथ होगी, जो मुझे नहीं लगता कि लॉन्ग टर्म सस्टेनेबल ग्रोथ होती है।
All right, Shubham, any sectors that you're looking out for that we should be focusing on, you feel?
Not sectors, as Gaurav says, there are plenty. I'm also looking at the political messaging that the economic survey puts on. And the CA pointed out the phrase for which he said he'll claim a patent, the stigmatized capitalists, which I think is a very important point. You know, sort of it brings all together. What he's essentially saying is that unless capital and reconstruction of capital from one industry to another industry is allowed, without blame, the naming and shaming can be there. But after that, it has to stop at a particular point. The reconstruction, the reworking has to happen without aspersions of government getting close to this or that. There is an issue that would continue to haunt private investment going forward.
चलिए, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आप दोनों मेहमानों को हमारे साथ चर्चा में जुड़ने के लिए। तुम्हारी कोशिश थी कि इकोनॉमिक सर्वे क्या कुछ कह रहा है, क्या कुछ हासिल किया है, नीतियों के जरिए कहां तक हम पहुंचे हैं और कहां पर खामियां थी। साथ ही ये भी समझने की कोशिश थी कि असल में दिशा क्या है और आगे की चुनौतियां क्या हैं। तो फिलहाल इस खास कवरेज में इतना ही, लेकिन आज से लेकर अगले 5 दिनों तक आप हर रोज राज्यसभा टीवी पर रात 8 से 10 बजे के बीच में बजट को लेकर स्पेशल कार्यक्रम देख सकते हैं, जहां पर हम कोशिश करेंगे आपकी क्या आकांक्षाएं हैं, सरकार के पास क्या स्कोप है, क्या नीतियां हो सकती हैं, उन सब पर चर्चा होगी, एक एक सेक्टर को लेकर और एक एक इलाके को लेकर। फिलहाल अभी इतना ही, नमस्कार।